As winter nights fall, the world becomes quieter and more confined. Outside, snow blankets the landscape, and a biting cold sweeps in. While inside, life seems to slow down. Doors are closed, lights dim, and familiar routines offer comfort in this harsh season. Nothing dramatic happens here. This is a gentle story of shared warmth, a steady rhythm of life, and the reassurance that the night will pass. As always, before we begin, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from today onwards? Let the day gradually fade away, and let the night fall naturally around you. Then, at your own pace, let the story drift and gently lull you to sleep. The wind arrived before the dark did. Over the open snowfields below Denali, the last light of afternoon thinned to a pale blue, and the first long breath of the night came sweeping down from the ridges. It carried powder snow across the ice like ghostly smoke, and bent the lonely spruce at the valley's edge, reminding anyone still outside that the real cold had not yet begun. Jacob Miller stood in that wind and watched the sky lose its color. He was 38, broad-shouldered from years of hauling gear and guiding winter groups in Alaska, with a kind of strength that came more from endurance than from the gym. His dark blonde hair, usually kept short, was crushed under a wool beanie, and the stubble on his jaw had frost forming around each grain. There was a calmness to his face that people often mistaken for indifference, but it was really concentration. Jacob tended to carry his worries inward, turn them over, and study them like maps rather than talk about them out loud. Now, his pale grey eyes moved from the sky to the small pile of equipment in the snow. Tents, poles, shovels, sleeping pads. Everything they had to make this empty white place livable for one more winter night. "Okay," he said, his voice muffled by the balaclava. "We set up here." Around him, his family began to move. Emily Miller, his wife, was a few steps away, stomping a flat pad into the snow with the slow, methodical patience of someone who had seen too many things go wrong because of small shortcuts. Emily was 36, with dark brown hair braided tight against her head, and intelligent hazel eyes that always seemed to be scanning for the person most in need of help. She worked as a nurse in a tiny clinic near Talkeetna, patching up frostbite, snowmobile crashes, and the kinds of quiet emergencies that came from isolation and long winters. Years earlier, watching a patient die simply because he'd refused to come in until it was too late had carved a thin mark into her. A private promise never to take fine as an answer. That promise lived in the firm but gentle way she spoke to people, and now in the way she checked each of their children's jackets before letting them help. "Lily, zipper all the way up. Noah, gloves on, not in your pockets," she called, voice calm but leaving no room for argument. Lily was 14, tall for her age, her frame still stretching into height, faster than muscle could keep up. She had Jacob's grey eyes, but where his gaze was inward, hers was outward. Curious, constantly measuring the world as if she could feel more comfortable once she understood it. She cradled a bundle of tent poles in her arms, the aluminum clinking softly with each step. Noah, at 10, was shorter and stockier, with a round, freckled face that flushed easily from cold or excitement. His dark eyes flicked from the horizon to the gear and back again. He wanted to be helpful, wanted to move fast. But a week of Jacob's training had taught him that speed without attention was its own kind of danger. He carried the folded tent itself, orange fabric bright against the blue-white snow. Ethan, the youngest at 6, was mostly bundled more than visible. Only his nose and the tips of his eyelashes showed under the hood of his little parka. He trailed behind Emily with a small snow shovel, almost as tall as he was, dragging it rather than lifting it, leaving a crooked line in the snow. Grace, 8 years old, walked beside Lily. She was not Jacob's daughter by blood, but might as well have been. Her mother, Jacob's older sister, had died 3 winters earlier in a car accident on an icy highway. And since then, Grace had folded herself into the Miller household as if she'd always been there. She had straight black hair that escaped from under her hat in uneven strands, and her quiet brown eyes watched the others carefully, copying what they did, rarely asking questions aloud. The loss of her mother had made her wary of sudden change, suspicious of loud promises, but deeply loyal to any routine that felt safe. There was one more member of the group, Ranger, a large, thick-furred Alaskan husky, 10 years old and mostly grey now around the muzzle. He wore a simple harness over his dense winter coat, and his blue eyes followed Jacob's every move. Ranger had once been part of a full sled team, running long routes for a friend of Jacob's, but age and a minor leg injury had slowly moved him from the front of the line to a place next to the family tent, where his job was now to warn, watch, and remind everyone that some creatures were built for this cold. The wind tugged at Jacob's hood again. He took a slow breath, tasting the sharpness of the air. They were a good 2-day snowmobile ride from Anchorage, on a frozen plateau east of Denali's main massif, far from the last line of trees. The closest shelter that wasn't made of fabric or hope was a ranger cabin nearly 10 miles away. This trip was half training, half family ritual. One more winter night spent together out in the open world before the season turned, and the guiding work became hectic again. "Let's move," Jacob said, more to himself than to them. He knelt in the snow and began to dig a shallow platform with his shovel, cutting down through the soft powder until the blades scraped the firmer layer beneath. Lily and Noah joined him, their smaller shovels flicking arcs of snow into the wind. The cold air bit at their cheeks, but exertion kept them warm. Ethan dutifully copied the motions, though his shovel barely made a dent. Emily finished checking the kids' layers and moved behind them, tamping down the edges of the platform with her boot, shaping a subtle lip to catch drifting snow. She had an instinctive sense for where discomfort might creep in later. A lump in the ground, a tilted surface that would cause someone to slide all night. A few yards away, Samuel watched in silence. Samuel Miller was Jacob's father, 71 years old, his back not as straight as it had once been, his hands marked by scars from decades of working in logging camps, on fishing boats, and finally, as a trapper before regulations and age pushed him toward retirement. His hair was more white than grey now, pulled back under a fur hat, and his eyes were a faded blue that had seen too many long winters to be impressed by another one. But they were sharp, still, and tonight they were turned toward the horizon. He stood slightly apart from the others, not out of distance, but habit. Samuel had grown up in a family where emotions were private and instructions were sparse. You learned by watching, by doing, by surviving your own mistakes. Over the years, he had softened a little with his grandchildren, but the old patterns remained. He would observe first, then intervene, only if something truly mattered. Right now, something truly mattered. Samuel licked a gloved finger and held it up. An old trick he didn't really need but trusted anyway. The wind hit from the northwest, harsh and steady, cutting across the plateau and funneling between low hills. He watched as loose snow lifted in lines, tracing invisible currents, showing him how the air moved. "Jacob," he called quietly. Jacob finished packing down the last section of the platform and straightened, joints protesting in the cold. "Yeah?" Samuel stepped closer, his boots creaking on the packed snow. Ranger shifted to make room for him, then sat back down, ears pricked. "You're facing the tent straight into it," Samuel said, nodding toward the northwest. His voice was low and gravelly, worn by years of wood smoke and cold air. "Turn it about 15 degrees east. Let the wind slide off, instead of slam in." Jacob followed his father's gaze. He could see it now, the way the gusts hit the invisible line where the tent would be, the way the fabric would be forced to take the full brunt of it like a hand pressed flat against a door. He'd set camp in winds like this 100 times, maybe more. He knew the principle, but a long day on the move, combined with watching the kids, had made his decisions a fraction more automatic, a fraction less precise. It was the kind of oversight that wouldn't matter much at 20 degrees below zero with a mild breeze. Tonight, with the temperature already sinking past 30 below and the wind building, it could mean the difference between a noisy, restless night and a dangerous one. 15 degrees, Samuel repeated, as if he were suggesting a minor adjustment to a picture frame rather than to their primary shelter. Jacob exhaled slowly, a cloud of vapor drifting from his mask. He felt a brief sting of pride in his chest, annoyance at having missed something so basic in front of his children, in front of his father. Then he let it go, the way he'd learned to let go of missteps on the mountain. Pride didn't hold back the wind. Small corrections did. "You're right," he said simply. He turned to the kids. "Hold up a second. We're shifting the layout." Noah frowned. "But we just flattened it." "Good," Jacob said. "Then it'll be easier to rotate the tent. We'll use the same spot. Just angle it a bit. Watch." They unfolded the tent, the bright orange fabric snapping in the wind like a warning flag. Jacob anchored one end with his boot, then showed Lily where the new front line would be, offset just enough that the gusts would slide along the curved edge instead of punching directly into the doorway. Noah moved to the opposite corner, gripping a guy line in his gloved hands. "Remember," Jacob said, his voice steady, "the mountain doesn't care if we get it right the first time, but it does care if we refuse to fix it." Emily glanced over at Samuel and offered a small nod of thanks. She knew the value of that 15 degrees. Hours of calmer flapping, less strain on poles, fewer tiny drafts sliding under seams to find bare skin. Samuel just grunted, the closest he often came to acknowledging gratitude, but there was a hint of warmth in his eyes as he watched his son adjust the tent without argument. Seeing Jacob accept correction in front of the children was, in its own way, another kind of lesson for them. Ranger circled once and lay down on the windward side of the budding camp, as if he, too, understood where the invisible wall needed to be strongest. They drove the first stakes into the snow, angling them so they would hold once the powder refroze. The wind tugged at the fabric constantly now, searching for leverage. But with each stake, each line tightened. Each careful adjustment, the tent became less a piece of cloth and more a small, stubborn shape in the white. Denali loomed somewhere behind the clouds, unseen but present. The sky had turned the flat, colourless grey that meant night was nearly there, even if the clock said it was only late afternoon. In winter, the hours condensed. Day and night slipped past each other quickly, exchanging the sky like a shared coat. Jacob paused for a moment, straightening again, letting his gaze travel once more across the plateau. He could feel the cold seeping through his layers where sweat had dampened his base shirt earlier in the day. The wind had a weight to it now, a thickness, as if it had settled in for the long haul. This would be a long night. He knew it in his bones, the way he knew the feel of ice under his boots, the way he knew the sound of a tent wall under strain. There would be no calm lull in the small hours, no gentle easing, just the steady pressure of air and cold testing every seam they had. Beside him, Samuel adjusted one last guy line, sighting along it with the eye of a man who had once trusted his life to the angle of knots and the strength of canvas. Better, the old man said quietly. Jacob nodded. He looked at his family. The kids moving around the tent in small, purposeful motions. Emily brushing snow away from the entry with careful sweeps of her glove. Ranger holding his ground against the invisible tide of wind. The night had not arrived yet. Not fully. But its first warning had. They had met it with a small correction, a 15-degree turn. And for now, that was enough. The tent was fully anchored now, its fabric stretched tight and humming softly as the wind pressed against it from the northwest. Outside, darkness settled quickly. Not dramatic, but absolute, swallowing the last pale line of the horizon. The temperature dropped with it, sliding past 30 below, as if the day had simply let go. Snow continued to fall in fine, dry grains that hissed against the tent walls and vanished into the drift lines already forming along the seams. Inside, the world became smaller. Jacob crawled into his sleeping bag last, careful not to brush snow inside with his boots. He shook them free outside the vestibule, clipped them together, and slid them down to the foot of the bag, where they would stay warm enough to be usable in the morning. Then he lay back, adjusting the hood of the bag until only a narrow opening remained around his nose and mouth. The bag was rated for extreme cold, thick with insulation, but Jacob did not sink into it the way he might have at home. He positioned himself deliberately, flat on his back, arms folded across his chest to minimize exposed surface area. Every movement was measured. Even shifting his shoulders felt like unnecessary spending. Sleep, here, was not a thing to fall into. It was a condition to be negotiated. Jacob closed his eyes. Not fully, just enough to rest them. He kept his breathing slow and shallow, counting each inhale and exhale in his head. He knew the danger of letting go too completely, of allowing his body to slide into the kind of deep, careless rest that belonged to warm rooms and thick walls. At this altitude, with air already thin and cold stealing heat with every breath, relaxation could turn treacherous. His muscles wanted to loosen. He refused them gently, holding himself in a state between tension and rest. Around him, the tent creaked and whispered. The poles flexed slightly, with each stronger gust, then returned to shape. Snow ticked against the fabric like dry rain. Emily lay to his left, her own sleeping bag zipped tight to her chin. She did not try to sleep yet. Instead, she turned her head slightly, angling her ear toward the quiet shapes lined up beside them. She had learned long ago, through years in the clinic and longer nights beside patients she could not monitor with machines, that breathing told stories if you listened closely enough. She listened now. Closest to her was Ethan. His small body barely made a rise in the sleeping bag, but his breath came in soft, quick puffs, fogging the inside of his hood. Emily noted the pace, fast but steady, and the faint whistle at the end of each exhale, where cold air met small lungs. She relaxed a fraction. That sound meant he was warm enough. Next was Grace. Grace slept more quietly, her breath slower, deeper than a child her age might normally have. Trauma had taught her early how to disappear inward, how to make herself small and unobtrusive. Even now, Emily could sense the caution in the way Grace rested, as if she were prepared to wake at the slightest disturbance. Emily adjusted the edge of Grace's bag just enough to cover a sliver of exposed cheek, then withdrew her hand. Beyond Grace lay Noah, who had insisted on sleeping near the tent wall despite Emily's preference. He liked to feel the structure, to know where the boundary was. His breathing was uneven. 2 quick breaths, a pause, then another, still settling after the excitement of the evening. Emily made a note of it. Not worried yet, just aware. She had spent too many nights listening for changes not to catalogue them instinctively. Lily was furthest away, near Jacob's feet. Nearly grown, she had arranged her bag with practiced efficiency, copying Jacob's movements without being told. Her breathing was slow, controlled, almost deliberate. Emily suspected Lily was awake, pretending not to be, testing herself against the cold in quiet competition with no one but her own expectations. Emily closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. She did not sleep. Not yet. Ranger lay curled in the small space between the family's bags and the tent wall, his thick tail tucked over his nose. The dog's breathing was deep and rhythmic, a low, steady sound beneath the sharper noises of the wind. His body radiated heat, creating a pocket of warmer air that drifted toward the children. Ranger had chosen his position carefully, as he always did, placing himself where he could both shield and monitor. His ears twitched occasionally, responding to sounds outside the tent that no human ear could fully separate from the wind. At the far end, Samuel lay still, almost indistinguishable from the gear piled beside him. He had arranged his sleeping bag with minimal fuss, refusing extra padding, refusing to complain about the cold creeping in through the ground. His breath was slow and measured, a sign not of comfort, but of discipline. Samuel did not waste energy on discomfort. He acknowledged it and moved on. Minutes passed, or perhaps it was longer. Time behaved differently here, stretching and compressing in ways Jacob had learned not to argue with. Jacob's mind drifted, then tightened again as his body attempted to pull him downward. A faint pressure built in his chest, subtle but unmistakable. He inhaled sharply, forcing more air into his lungs, then exhaled in a controlled stream. The sensation eased. He repeated the cycle, anchoring himself in awareness. This was the rhythm of the night. Drift, pull, correction. Outside, the wind intensified, flattening the tent wall on Jacob's right side for a moment before releasing it. The fabric snapped back into place with a dull thump. Snow slid down the sides and settled at the base. Emily felt the vibration through the ground pad and listened again, checking the disruption. Ethan stirred, then resettled. Grace's breathing hitched once, then smoothed out. Noah shifted, muttering something unintelligible into his hood. Lily did not move. Emily reached out and placed her gloved hand lightly on Jacob's arm. It was not a question, not comfort exactly. More a confirmation that they were both awake, both keeping watch in their own ways. Jacob did not turn his head, but he flexed his fingers once beneath the glove, acknowledging her. Another long stretch of quiet followed, broken only by the constant pressure of the wind and the faint creak of the tent poles. The cold pressed inward steadily, testing insulation, searching for weak points. The air inside the tent felt thick, each breath slightly more effortful than the last. Condensation formed along the inner walls, a fine frost pattern, growing slowly where warm breath met cold fabric. Emily noted it all, the sound of Ranger's breathing changing slightly as he adjusted his position, the way Noah's pauses between breaths shortened, the subtle shift in Lily's posture as she pulled her knees closer to her chest. These were not problems yet. They were data. Jacob remained still. His muscles ached from holding tension, from resisting the urge to curl or stretch. He focused on small things. The sensation of the ground pad beneath his spine, the steady pressure of the sleeping bag around his shoulders, the faint warmth pooling where Ranger's body radiated heat. He reminded himself, again and again, that the goal was not comfort. The goal was presence. Sleep would come in fragments, if at all. It would be shallow, interrupted, and unhelpful in the ways sleep was meant to be helpful. But rest could still exist here, in the careful conservation of movement, in the quiet monitoring of breath and warmth. Rest could be vigilance. Emily finally allowed her eyes to close halfway, her attention softening without disappearing. She had learned how to hover in that state, alert, but not tense, letting her senses float just beneath the surface. If something changed, a cough, a sharp inhale, a sudden silence, she would know immediately. The wind did not ease. It did not grow worse either. It simply continued, indifferent and constant. Inside the tent, 7 people and 1 aging dog held their small circle of warmth against it, breath by breath. No one slept deeply. No one truly rested. But they endured the night in the only way the night allowed. Awake enough to remain, still enough to conserve, together enough to matter. And for now, that was all the night required of them. The silence arrived slowly, not all at once. It settled into the tent the way frost crept across the fabric. Thin at first, almost unnoticeable, then gradually thickening until it became part of the structure itself. Outside, the wind continued its steady pressure. But inside, every unnecessary sound had been trimmed away. No voices, no shifting without purpose. Even breath seemed quieter now, shaped carefully as it passed through layers of wool and fabric. 7 people lay close together in the narrow space, each aware of the others without looking. The rules of the night had already been established, though no one had spoken them aloud. Words require air. Air required effort. Effort meant heat lost. And heat, tonight, was the most valuable thing any of them possessed. Jacob understood this instinctively. He had spent years learning when to speak and when silence carried more meaning. Lying flat in his sleeping bag, he focused on stillness as a form of participation. His jaw remained relaxed, teeth slightly apart to avoid tension. Even swallowing felt excessive. He let his thoughts slow until they no longer pushed forward, until they drifted in loose patterns that required no reaction. In his experience, silence was not emptiness. It was a working condition. Emily felt it too, the way the quiet sharpened her awareness. Without conversation to anchor the mind, every small sensation grew clearer. The brush of fabric against skin, the faint crackle of frost forming where breath met cold air. She resisted the instinct to whisper reassurances to the children, knowing that calm here came not from words but from consistency. Her stillness was a message in itself. Samuel lay unmoving, his posture unchanged from earlier. He had grown up in a household where silence was not imposed but expected, a natural part of winter life. As a boy, he had learned that unnecessary talk in the cold led to mistakes. Missed sounds, misjudged weather, wasted breath. The years had not softened that lesson. Even now, surrounded by family, he treated the quiet with respect. Ranger shifted once, his claws clicking faintly against the ground pad, then stilled himself. The sound lingered longer than expected in the enclosed space. Jacob noticed the tension ripple through the tent, subtle but shared. Ranger seemed to sense it too. His ears flattened slightly, and he settled his chin back onto his paws, breathing more slowly. The dog had learned, over a decade of winters, that stillness mattered. It was Noah who felt the rule most sharply. At 10, his world was still shaped by questions. Curiosity rose in him without warning, sparked by sensations he did not yet have names for. The way the wind sounded different now than it had earlier. the faint vibration beneath his back, as if the ground itself were humming. A thought formed in his mind, simple and immediate, and before he could stop it, his lips parted. Dad. The word barely made it out. More breath than sound. But in the silence, it felt loud. Noah froze. He felt the mistake instantly. A flush of heat rising to his cheeks despite the cold. His body tensed, waiting for correction, for a sharp whisper or a look. But none came. Instead, Lily's hand found his. She did not look at him. She did not shush him or squeeze hard. Her fingers simply wrapped around his, firm and steady. A quiet interruption. Lily's hand was cold even through the glove. But the contact grounded him. It told him everything he needed to know without sound. Not now. Not here. It's okay. Lily had not always been like this. A year ago, she might have rolled her eyes, might have whispered an impatient warning. But something had shifted in her over the past winter, shaped by responsibility and by watching her parents navigate situations where calm mattered more than reaction. She had learned that leadership did not always announce itself. Sometimes it was just presence. Noah swallowed, nodded once into the darkness, and closed his mouth. His question dissolved, unspoken, and with it went the small burst of energy it would have taken to express it. He focused instead on Lily's hand, on the rhythm of his own breath, on the rule he was learning not from instruction, but from experience. Grace noticed the exchange without turning her head. She had always been good at noticing things that were not meant to be noticed. The quiet restraint Lily showed, the way Noah accepted it without resentment. These were the kinds of moments Grace stored away carefully. They made the world feel more predictable, more survivable. Emily, listening from a short distance away, registered the shift as well. She felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to intervene, to guide. Then she let it go. This was not a moment that needed correction. It was one that needed space. The silence deepened again, settling back into place, as if it had never been disturbed. Time moved forward in subtle increments. Frost thickened along the tent walls, turning condensation into pale, crystalline patterns. The wind maintained its pace, pressing, releasing, pressing again. Each cycle tested the tent's seams, the stakes holding firm beneath the snow. The 15-degree adjustment Samuel had suggested earlier made itself known now, as the gusts slid along the curve of the fabric, instead of slamming directly into it. The difference was quiet, but profound. Jacob felt a faint tightening in his chest again, the familiar signal that his body wanted more air. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, then exhaled through pursed lips. The sensation passed. He resisted the urge to shift position, to stretch his legs or roll onto his side. Movement invited heat loss. Heat loss invited trouble. Silence, stillness, awareness. These were the tools the night demanded. Emily continued her listening, though now it was less active, more ambient. She noted that Noah's breathing had evened out, matching Lily's steady rhythm. Ethan let out a soft sigh, then settled deeper into his bag. Grace's breath remained quiet, measured. No coughing, no sharp inhales, no alarming pauses. The quiet held. Samuel's breathing slowed further, almost imperceptible. He was not asleep. Not truly. He existed in a state he had learned over decades, one where rest did not require unconsciousness. The silence suited him. It asked nothing. Ranger lifted his head briefly, sniffing the air, then lowered it again. Outside, something shifted. A change in the wind's tone, perhaps, or a distant movement carried on the current. Whatever it was, it did not concern him enough to alert the others. The dog trusted the silence too. In the absence of speech, thoughts wandered freely. Jacob found himself thinking of the years before, of nights spent in warmer shelters, of times when silence had meant loneliness rather than safety. He pushed those memories aside gently. This silence was different. It was shared. It was purposeful. For Noah, the silence became a lesson he would not forget. It taught him that restraint was not weakness, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was hold a question inside yourself until it no longer mattered. He felt Lily's hand loosen slightly, but remain in contact, a quiet promise that she was there. Lily felt a small shift within herself as well. She recognized the moment for what it was, a choice made correctly, without acknowledgement. It gave her a sense of competence that did not need praise. She let her hand rest there a moment longer, then slowly withdrew it, careful not to disturb the quiet. The tent held its breath. No one spoke. No one needed to. The rule had been accepted, not enforced. Silence was no longer an instruction. It was simply how things were done. And in that shared understanding, energy was saved, warmth preserved, and the night moved forward without resistance. Jacob became aware of his breathing before anything else. Not because it was difficult, but because it demanded attention. In warmer places, breathing belonged to the background, something the body handled quietly and without instruction. Here, inside the thin-walled tent, breathing had moved to the foreground. It was no longer automatic. It was a task. He lay flat on his back, shoulders relaxed but unmoving, chin slightly tucked, so his airway stayed open without strain. The sleeping bag rose and fell with each breath, a slow, deliberate motion he controlled carefully. In through the nose. A pause, just long enough to feel the air settle. Out through the mouth, lips barely parted. He avoided deep inhalations. Too much air invited coughing. Too little created panic. The balance lived somewhere narrow and precise, and Jacob stayed within it. He had learned this over years, not from instruction manuals or training courses, but from nights exactly like this one, nights where letting go too completely meant waking suddenly with a tight chest and a racing heart, nights where the brain, deprived of oxygen, would pull him back from the edge of sleep with sharp urgency. He did not fight that instinct anymore. He worked with it. Sleep tonight was not a destination. It was a boundary he approached and retreated from repeatedly. Jacob allowed his eyelids to rest closed, but he kept his mind lightly tethered. He counted breaths, not in numbers, but in patterns. Long, short, short, long. Sometimes he focused on the sensation of air cooling his nostrils, sometimes on the faint warmth returning as it left his lungs. When his thoughts began to blur too much, he tightened his awareness just enough to stay present. The goal was not rest in the usual sense. It was continuity, breath after breath, moment after moment. Around him, the tent remained quiet. Emily slept lightly, her breathing shallow but even. She had slipped into a state somewhere between rest and vigilance, the kind of sleep that mothers learned whether they wanted to or not. Even now, her body remained tuned to the small sounds of the children. The shift of fabric, a change in rhythm. She did not know Jacob was awake. She did not need to. His steadiness carried through the space without signal. Samuel, however, was awake. His eyes were open, though the darkness made no distinction between open and closed. He lay with his hands folded loosely over his chest, fingers curled from years of cold weather work. The joints were knotted and enlarged, the skin thickened and scarred. But the hands were steady. They had learned patience long before his mind did. As Jacob regulated his breathing, Samuel drifted backward through memory, carried not by thought, but by sensation. He remembered the first time he had learned to sleep without sleeping. He had been 14, tall for his age, but still narrow-shouldered, all elbows and angles. That winter had come early, harder than expected. His father had taken him out on a week-long trip, farther than they usually went to test him, not with words, but with conditions. On the third night, the wind had risen after dark, sudden and relentless. Their shelter then had been cruder than this tent. Heavier canvas stretched over a frame that groaned with each gust. Samuel remembered lying stiffly on his back, heart pounding, convinced that sleep meant vulnerability. He had tried to rest the way he did at home, letting his body sink, letting his thoughts drift. It had not worked. He remembered the panic that followed, the way his chest had seized, how he had woken gasping, convinced something was wrong with him. He had whispered to his father then, breaking the silence in fear. His father had not scolded him. Instead, the older man had shifted closer and placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, heavy and grounding. "You don't sleep here," his father had murmured, barely louder than breath. "You stay." That was the lesson. His father had taught him to keep one part of his mind awake, to anchor himself in sensation. Feel the ground, feel the air. Count breaths if needed. Let the body rest without disappearing into it. It was not comfortable. It was not peaceful. But it worked. Lying here now, decades later, Samuel felt the same controlled stillness settle over him. His breathing was slower than Jacob's, shaped by years of adaptation. He did not count breaths anymore. His body knew the rhythm. Still, he recognized the familiar state in Jacob beside him. He could sense it without looking, the way two people trained in the same discipline recognized each other's posture. Ranger shifted again, this time lifting his head and repositioning his body slightly closer to Jacob's legs. The dog was old, nearly 11 now, with a thick greying coat and cloudy eyes that still caught movement easily. His muzzle had gone pale over the years, and one ear bore a small notch from a long-ago winter injury. Ranger slept deeply when he could, but even he did not fully surrender to unconsciousness on nights like this. His breathing synchronized loosely with Jacob's, not by design, but by proximity and habit. Outside, the wind pressed harder for a while, then eased back to its steady pace. The tent flexed and settled. Frost continued to thicken along the inner walls, dulling the fabric's color and softening reflected light from the snow beyond. Jacob felt the familiar pull toward deeper sleep again. His breathing slowed almost too much. A faint tightening crept into his chest. A subtle warning. He responded immediately, increasing the depth of his next inhale by a fraction, then releasing it slowly. The sensation eased. His heart rate remained stable. He stayed. He thought briefly of mornings, of how this deliberate vigilance would leave him tired, slightly hollowed out, but functional. That was enough. Full recovery was not part of the agreement here. Survival was. Samuel's thoughts settled back into the present. He did not dwell on the memory. It had served its purpose. He adjusted his breathing once, a minor correction, then returned to stillness. There was nothing to fix. The system held. Time stretched, then compressed. Minutes passed without markers. The darkness remained complete, but it no longer felt oppressive. It was simply the container for what they were doing. 7 people breathed inside the tent, not in unison, not coordinated, but compatible. No one slept deeply. No one panicked. The night did not demand more than this. Jacob maintained his rhythm, breath by breath, aware without strain, resting without surrender. He did not chase sleep. He allowed the night to pass through him instead. And that, for now, was enough. The first pull came without warning. Jacob had allowed his awareness to soften just enough that the edges of thought blurred, not into dreams, but into a lighter, drifting state where time lost its shape. Then his body reacted on its own. A sudden tightness gripped his chest, sharp but brief, like a hand closing and releasing. His eyes opened instantly in the dark. He drew in a deeper breath, controlled but firm, and held it for a fraction longer than before. The sensation receded as quickly as it had come. He did not panic. This, too, was familiar. At altitude and in extreme cold, the body did not wait for fear to announce itself. It acted first, dragging the mind back toward wakefulness with physical insistence. Jacob had learned not to fight that reflex, and not to dramatize it either. Panic wasted energy. Panic made breathing erratic. Instead, he acknowledged the interruption, adjusted, and continued. He lay still, allowing his heart rate to settle. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Slow, measured. He counted only until the rhythm returned, then let the numbers dissolve. Outside, the wind maintained its steady pressure, neither rising nor easing, as if it had chosen a pace and committed to it. Snow scraped softly along the tent wall, building and sliding again. The sound had become constant enough that it no longer startled anyone inside. It was simply part of the night now. Jacob drifted again, cautiously. Minutes later, it happened a second time. This pull was gentler, but more insistent, a shallow hunger for air that crept in quietly. His breathing had slowed too much. His chest responded before his thoughts did. He inhaled sharply, then steadied himself, adjusting the pace by instinct. He did not sit up. He did not tense his muscles. He corrected and remained. This was not terror. This was maintenance. Each interruption reminded him of the boundary he could approach but not cross. Sleep could skim the surface. It could not take him under. Nearby, Emily shifted her attention. She had been resting in that half-sleep she knew well. Awareness floating just below consciousness, when something changed. Not a sound, not movement, just a subtle irregularity in the pattern she had been cataloguing for hours. Grace's breathing, usually quiet and even, had quickened. Emily did not react immediately. She listened first, counting silently. Shorter breaths, slightly higher frequency, still steady, but working harder than before. Grace lay curled on her side, knees drawn up instinctively, her small frame tucked tight within the sleeping bag. At 8 years old, she was thin and light, her body losing heat faster than the others, if not watched carefully. Her dark hair had slipped loose from beneath her hat, clinging faintly to her cheek with condensation. Her face was turned slightly downward, pressing into the fabric. Emily recognized the signs. Not danger yet, just discomfort, compounded by cold and thin air. Carefully, she shifted closer, moving with exaggerated slowness to avoid unnecessary noise or motion. She slipped one gloved hand between Grace's shoulder blades and felt the tension there, the subtle rigidity of a child sleeping too shallowly. Emily did not wake her. She did not speak. Instead, she adjusted. She guided Grace gently onto her back, easing her shoulders open so her chest could rise more freely. She pulled the edge of the sleeping bag higher, sealing a small gap where cold air had been creeping in. Then, with 2 fingers, she repositioned Grace's hood so it no longer pressed against her mouth. The effect was almost immediate. Grace's breathing slowed by a fraction, then another. The shallow quickness eased into something more sustainable. Emily stayed there a moment longer, hand resting lightly on Grace's sternum, feeling the rhythm stabilize. Only when she was satisfied did she withdraw, retreating back into stillness, as if she had never moved. Jacob sensed the movement beside him, not with his eyes, but with the awareness that came from long familiarity. He did not turn his head. He trusted Emily. He always had. Another pull came for him not long after. This one stronger than the last. His body jerked awake more fully now, heart rate spiking briefly as oxygen levels dipped. He responded with discipline rather than fear. Inhale. Pause. Exhale. He widened the opening of his sleeping bag hood by a finger's width, allowing slightly more air to circulate. Cold rushed in immediately, sharp against his face. But he accepted it. Better cold than panic. The sensation passed. Jacob remained awake longer this time, letting his breathing stabilize fully before allowing his thoughts to loosen again. He focused on concrete sensations. The pressure of the ground pad beneath his hips, the faint warmth radiating from Ranger's body near his legs, the steady presence of the tent poles holding their shape against the wind. This was not a nightmare. There were no images chasing him, no fear spirals, no sudden terror of suffocation. There was only the body doing what it needed to do to survive in an environment that did not accommodate comfort. Each interruption was a message, not a threat. Samuel, awake in his own quiet way, registered the rhythm of Jacob's breathing, changing and then settling again. He did not move. He did not offer reassurance. He knew better than to interfere. These moments belonged to the body and to experience, not to conversation. Ranger lifted his head briefly when Jacob's breathing sharpened, his ears angling forward. The dog's eyes opened, reflecting faint light from the frost-brightened tent wall. After a few seconds, sensing that the disturbance had passed, Ranger lowered his head again, satisfied. The night continued to test them in small, persistent ways. Jacob was pulled back 3 more times over the next hour, each episode slightly different in intensity, but identical in pattern. Drift, pull, correction, settle. He did not grow angry at the interruptions. He did not wish them away. He accepted them as part of the contract he had entered when he brought his family here. Emily remained alert, though her eyes were closed now. She monitored without effort, tracking breath and movement as naturally as others followed conversation. When Grace shifted again later in the night, Emily noted that the breathing remained steady. The adjustment had held. Lily slept lightly, consciousness hovering near the surface, aware of her brother's presence and her own body's limits. Noah dreamed briefly, then surfaced again, breathing faster for a moment before calming himself without waking fully. Ethan remained blissfully unaware of the negotiations happening around him, his small body warm and sheltered, sighing occasionally as children do. The wind did not change. The cold did not relent, but nothing worsened. Jacob eventually allowed himself to rest in shorter intervals, never fully crossing into deep sleep, but conserving energy where he could. His breathing remained intentional, responsive, alive. This was not suffering. It was adaptation. As the night stretched on, the tent remained intact, the family remained present, and the body's alarms, though insistent, never became desperate. The night was harsh, but it was not a nightmare. The cold found the objects first. It always did. Inside the tent, where 7 bodies created a fragile pocket of warmth, the air hovered just above freezing. Outside, the temperature continued its slow descent, pressing inward through fabric and ground alike. The difference between what lived and what failed often came down to where heat was allowed to linger and where it was not. At the foot of Jacob's sleeping bag, a small cluster of items lay tucked carefully beneath layers of insulation. Boot liners, soft and removable, rested side by side, their synthetic padding compressed, but protected. 2 spare headlamp batteries were sealed in a fabric pouch, pressed close to the warmth of human bodies. A metal water bottle, wrapped in a wool sock, lay horizontally, so ice would not form at the mouth first. These things did not sleep. They endured. Jacob had placed them there deliberately, before lying down, following a routine so practiced, it no longer felt like a choice. Years ago, early in his guiding career, he had learned what happened when gear was treated as separate from survival. Frozen boots that refused to flex in the morning, batteries drained to uselessness by cold, water trapped solid inside its container, forcing dehydration before noon. He did not make those mistakes anymore. The bootliners belonged to him and Emily, shaped over years of use to the contours of their feet. Without them, their outer shells would be nothing more than rigid plastic, impossible to wear. The batteries were small, but vital. Without light, darkness became more than an absence. It became a hazard. The water bottle was life reduced to a simple form. Frozen, it might as well not exist. Jacob felt their presence faintly, a solid pressure near his calves. He did not check them. He trusted the system. Lily, however, was awake. She lay on her side, knees drawn slightly upward, her breath slow and quiet. The darkness pressed in around her, familiar now rather than threatening. She had not intended to stay awake this long. She had tried to let herself drift the way she did at home, but the cold and the awareness of space made that impossible. Instead, her mind wandered in small, careful loops. Her gaze shifted downward, toward the foot of the sleeping bags, where she could just make out the vague shapes beneath the fabric. She knew what was there, without seeing it clearly. Her father had shown her, years ago, on a different winter trip, when she was still small enough to ride in the sled behind him. She remembered that night clearly. They had been camped near a frozen river, the kind that looked solid, but hummed softly beneath the ice. Lily had woken early, excited for the day, and tried to put on her boots on her own. They had been stiff, unyielding, the liners frozen solid from being left outside the sleeping bag. She remembered the frustration, the tears she had tried to hide. Jacob had crouched beside her then, his breath fogging the air between them. He hadn't scolded her. He hadn't rushed. He had simply explained, his voice calm and direct. Objects die before people do, he'd said, flexing the frozen liner in his hands. And when they do, people follow. She hadn't fully understood then. She understood now. Lily watched the outline of the bootliners beneath the fabric, her mind connecting cause and effect with a clarity that only came from experience. These things were not accessories. They were extensions of the body. Protecting them was not caution. It was necessity. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing they were there, warm enough to function. It gave her a sense of control in a night that offered very little of it. Nearby, Noah stirred. He shifted his legs slightly, brushing against Lily's foot. The movement was unconscious, a response to discomfort or a dream half remembered. Lily did not pull away. Instead, she adjusted subtly, making room without creating space for cold to creep in. She remembered suddenly another lesson: how warmth moved between bodies when allowed to. Emily noticed the shift, though she did not open her eyes. Her awareness had sharpened to the point where even small movements registered. She felt a momentary urge to reach out, to check that Noah's feet were still covered properly. She resisted. She had already done so earlier. Constant checking wasted energy. Trusting the setup mattered just as much. Grace slept more deeply now, her breathing steady and slow. Emily's earlier adjustment had held. Grace's small body remained aligned, airway clear, warmth distributed evenly. Emily took quiet note of it, and let herself relax another fraction. Ranger shifted again, stretching his legs slightly before curling back into himself. His thick coat insulated him well, but even he benefited from proximity. One of his paws rested against the side of Jacob's sleeping bag, absorbing warmth through the fabric. Ranger had learned, over time, which objects mattered most. He avoided stepping on the gear, avoided jostling the foot of the bags. His instincts were tuned to preservation. Samuel lay awake, thinking not of the present, but of a winter long ago, when he had not yet learned this lesson. He remembered a night when he had been careless, young and impatient, leaving a canteen outside his bedroll because it was bulky and inconvenient. By morning, it had frozen solid. The day that followed had been one of rationing and quiet misery. His mouth dry, his head aching, his body weakened. No one had said, "I told you so." The cold had been teacher enough. Lying here now, Samuel felt a muted sense of approval. Jacob had learned well. He had passed the lesson on. The wind outside carried on, scraping snow along the tent walls. The sound was constant, a reminder that nothing beyond the fabric cared whether their systems held or failed. The mountain offered no forgiveness for oversight. Jacob stirred slightly, just enough to feel the placement of the items near his feet. He adjusted his legs a fraction, ensuring the water bottle remained horizontal. The batteries pressed close. He did not open his eyes. The movement was efficient, practiced, complete. This was the quiet work of survival. Not dramatic, not heroic, just precise. Time passed. The cold deepened, then plateaued. Frost thickened on the inside of the tent, dulling sound and light alike. The family remained suspended in their small pocket of warmth, sustained not only by their bodies, but by the objects they had chosen to protect. Lily's thoughts drifted again, this time toward the morning. She imagined slipping her feet into warm liners, the relief immediate and grounding. She imagined the click of a headlamp switching on without hesitation, the beam cutting cleanly through the pre-dawn darkness. She imagined drinking water that flowed instead of clanked. These small certainties mattered. She closed her eyes at last, not sleeping deeply, but resting in the knowledge that some things had been done right. Jacob's breathing remained steady. Emily's vigilance softened, but did not disappear. Samuel lay still, content in the quiet evidence of preparation. Ranger slept, one eye half open, listening. Outside, the cold waited patiently for a mistake. None came. Emily woke without opening her eyes. It was not a sound that pulled her back to full awareness, but a familiar, internal calculation. The quiet sense that enough time had passed and the body needed tending. The cold had settled into a steady, unyielding presence, and the air inside the tent felt thinner now, as if the night itself were drawing a long breath and holding it. She remained still for a moment, listening, confirming what she already suspected. The children were stable. Jacob's breathing was controlled, deliberate. Ranger slept with the patient vigilance of an animal that understood routine better than language. It was time. She moved carefully, unzipping her sleeping bag a hand's width at a time, to keep warmth from spilling out all at once. Her fingers protested immediately, stiff and aching even inside her gloves. Emily was used to that pain, the dull, ringing sensation that came with cold work. But she respected it. Pain meant circulation was still present. She sat up slowly, shoulders rounding forward to conserve heat, then leaned toward the small cooking area set near the tent's vestibule. Samuel stirred as she did, the movement subtle but unmistakable. He opened his eyes and nodded once, already aware of the plan. No words passed between them. They had done this before, enough times to understand the rhythm. One melted snow, while the other rested. Then they switched. No one stayed up too long. Fatigue was as dangerous as dehydration. Samuel rose first, his movements economical, as if each gesture had been trimmed down to its most efficient form. He was 71 now, lean and weathered, with a face etched by decades of cold wind and reflected light. His beard had gone nearly white, cropped short to keep ice from forming in it. He moved with a stiffness that spoke of old injuries rather than weakness. When he reached for the stove, his hands trembled. Not from fear, but from exposure. Emily watched him assemble the small camp stove, shielding it from the draft with practiced precision. The metal clicked softly as he locked pieces into place, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet tent. He winced slightly, then continued. Silence was preferred, but function mattered more. He scooped clean snow into the pot, compressing it gently so it would melt evenly. Snow looked abundant out there, endless and forgiving. But Samuel knew better. It took time and fuel to turn it into something usable. It took patience. Emily knelt opposite him, holding the windscreen in place with numb fingers while he struck the igniter. The stove caught on the second try, a small blue flame flaring briefly before settling into a steady burn. Heat radiated outward in a tight circle, just enough to matter. They waited. The snow slumped slowly as it warmed, collapsing inward with a soft hiss. Drops of water pooled at the bottom of the pot, dark and heavy compared to the whiteness they came from. Samuel adjusted the flame, careful not to let it roar. Fuel was finite. Everything was finite. Emily rubbed her hands together near the flame, not close enough to burn, just enough to coax feeling back into her fingers. Her hands were small, dexterous, marked with faint scars from years of needles and scalpels. She had learned to trust them, even when sensation dulled. She glanced toward the sleeping shapes behind them, reassured by the steady rise and fall of the bags. Samuel cleared his throat quietly, the sound barely more than a breath. He leaned back against the tent wall, resting while the snow continued its slow transformation. "First time I did this," he murmured, voice low and rough. "I was 16. Emily turned her head slightly, listening without shifting her body. She had learned that Samuel spoke rarely, but when he did, the words carried weight. "Went out with my uncle," he continued. "Late season. Thought we'd be back before dark. Weather didn't agree." The flame flickered, steady but alive. The pot began to steam faintly. "He showed me how to hunt in winter," Samuel said. "Not the chasing kind, the waiting kind. How to read tracks that don't look like tracks anymore. How to know when to stop moving." Emily imagined him then. A tall, narrow boy, eyes sharp with youth, trying to mirror the calm of an older man who knew the land intimately. She pictured the silence of a frozen forest, the way sound carried differently when everything was held still by cold. "We stayed out overnight," Samuel said. "No shelter worth the name, just snow piled against a fallen tree. He kept me awake most of the night, told stories, not loud, just enough to keep my mind from slipping." "What kind of stories?" Emily asked quietly. Samuel's mouth curved in a faint smile, barely visible in the dim light. "Nothing special. Old hunts, mistakes he'd made, animals he'd lost, and animals he'd spared. Said the point wasn't to be brave. Said it was to stay." The water began to bubble gently now, steam curling upward and frosting the tent wall above. Samuel reached forward to stir it, careful not to spill. He said if you let your mind wander too far, your body would follow. Samuel added, "So you give it something simple, a story, a task." Emily nodded. She understood that instinctively. As a nurse, she had learned how fragile the line was between calm and collapse, how easily the mind could tip the body in one direction or another. They poured the melted water into insulated bottles, working slowly to avoid burns or spills. Each bottle was capped tightly and tucked into a sleeve, then placed near the foot of the sleeping bags, where it would remain liquid through the night. The warmth radiated outward, subtle but real. After a few minutes, Samuel leaned back again, flexing his hand. The tremor had lessened, but it had not disappeared. Emily noted it without comment. "Your turn," he said. She nodded and took his place, scooping fresh snow into the pot, while Samuel retreated into his sleeping bag to rest. The cold bit at her fingers as she worked, sharper now that she was no longer moving. She welcomed the sting, using it to stay alert. She melted another potful, then another, repeating the cycle with careful attention. As she worked, Samuel's voice drifted again from the darkness. Softer now, slower. He spoke of that hunt, of the long wait before dawn, of the way the forest had come alive in subtle movements once the light returned. He spoke not to impress or instruct, but to pass time, to keep his own awareness tethered. Emily listened, letting the rhythm of his words anchor her. The story was not dramatic. No triumph, no loss, just endurance. She found comfort in that. When the bottles were filled and secured, Emily extinguished the stove and sat back, hands cradling the last of the warmth. Her fingers throbbed as sensation returned fully, a deep ache that promised stiffness later. She accepted it. Samuel slept now, breathing slow and even. Emily remained awake a little longer, ensuring the bottles were positioned correctly, ensuring nothing had shifted. Beyond the tent, the night pressed on, indifferent. Inside, water existed where it had not before. Small, necessary, earned. Emily eased back into her sleeping bag, careful to seal the zipper fully. She lay still, listening as the quiet reclaimed the space. The children slept on, unaware of the work that had kept morning possible. The stove cooled. The snow outside continued to fall. The night moved forward, one careful task at a time. The night thinned into a quieter kind of cold after the water was secured, and the stove went dark. Inside the tent, warmth rearranged itself slowly, settling around bodies and objects that had earned their place. The wind continued to press from the outside, but its voice softened, as if it had learned the shape of the shelter and accepted it. Darkness remained complete, yet the interior felt steadier now, less brittle. The children slept in fragments. Ethan was the first to stir. At 6, his world was still divided into simple categories: warm and cold, safe and not safe. And tonight, he hovered between them. He rolled once onto his side, knees tucked instinctively toward his chest, and let out a small breath that might have become a whimper in another place. It didn't. His mittened hand brushed the fabric of his sleeping bag, found the familiar texture, and stilled. His breathing resumed its gentle rhythm, uneven, but calm. Noah shifted next. His dreams were shallow, crowded with sensations rather than images. He frowned briefly, eyebrows knitting together beneath the edge of his hat, then relaxed. He did not call out. He did not reach for anyone. Instead, he adjusted his position by inches, pulling his shoulders deeper into the bag and pressing his feet against the warm pocket near the liners. The movement was clumsy, but purposeful. He settled again, breath slowing. Grace remained quiet, her sleep light, but contained. She had learned, in ways no child should have to learn, that noise did not always bring help. Since losing her mother, she had become careful with sound, choosing silence as a kind of armor. Tonight, that instinct served her well. She stirred once, lips parting as if to speak, then closed them. Her body found comfort in stillness, and she drifted back into rest without a word. Lily lay awake longer than the others. 14 brought awareness without authority, understanding without control. She sensed every small change: the shift in wind tone, the faint hiss of ice settling on the tent wall, the way Ethan's breathing fluttered and steadied. She felt responsibility settle on her shoulders without being asked. It wasn't heavy. It was simply there. She adjusted her own posture carefully, easing her weight so it didn't pull warmth away from Noah's side. Her movements were deliberate, almost adult. She did not sigh. She did not roll dramatically. She had learned, over the past year especially, that endurance was quiet work. Jacob watched all of this without moving. He lay on his back, eyes closed, breathing deliberate but alert, the way he had learned to remain when sleep could not be trusted. The children's movements registered in his awareness like ripples on water, noticed, acknowledged, then allowed to pass. He felt Ethan's brief restlessness, Noah's careful adjustment, Lily's steady presence. He recognized the pattern immediately, not as a parent counting heads, but as a guide reading a group. They were uncomfortable. They were cold. They were not in distress. That distinction mattered. Jacob remembered other nights, years ago, when discomfort had quickly become complaint, when small hardships had turned into loud declarations of unfairness. He had not scolded then. He had simply adjusted expectations, taught by example rather than instruction. Tonight, he realized, the lesson was no longer being taught. It was being absorbed. He felt a tightening in his chest, not from altitude or cold, but from recognition. They were learning, not because he told them to, not because the night demanded it loudly, but because the environment made the lesson unavoidable and honest. Emily slept lightly, her body resting in that narrow band between vigilance and surrender. She sensed the children's movements, but did not intervene. She trusted what she felt in the air of the tent, that the discomfort was within tolerable bounds, that nothing required correction yet. Her restraint was not indifference. It was confidence. Samuel slept more deeply now, his breathing slow and steady, the kind that came from long familiarity with hardship. His face was relaxed in a way it rarely was during the day, the lines etched by wind and labor smoothing slightly. He had lived long enough to recognize the sound of a group that would make it through the night. Ranger shifted, lifting his head briefly to check the children. His blue eyes caught the faintest reflection from the frost-lined wall, then softened. He resettled with a low sigh, pressing his back against the sleeping bags to share warmth. At nearly 11, his movements were slower, his joints stiff in the cold, but his instincts remained sharp. He knew when to be alert and when to conserve. Outside, snow continued to fall in fine grains, whispering as it met the tent. The wind traced familiar paths along the fabric, no longer testing, just existing. Ethan stirred again, this time more fully. His mouth opened as if to speak, the impulse rising with the discomfort in his chest. The sound hovered at the edge of being. Then he paused. He had learned something too. He remembered dimly the way sound disappeared into the wind, the way calling out did not change the cold. He shifted his shoulders, tucked his chin deeper, and breathed. The moment passed. He slept again. Jacob felt it, that almost cry that never came. He did not move. He did not reach out. He knew that doing so now would teach a different lesson, that relief came from interruption rather than adaptation. There would be time for comfort later. Tonight, they were learning a quieter skill. Noah's breathing quickened briefly, then slowed. He pressed his toes against the warm bundle near the foot of the bags and smiled faintly, half dreaming. The small success of finding warmth without help registered somewhere deep and stayed there. Grace dreamed of her mother for a moment, not the loss, not the hospital, but a memory of hands braiding her hair on a winter morning. She shifted, lips parting, then closed them again. The dream softened, dissolved, and left her calm. Lily finally allowed her eyes to close fully. She did not fall into deep sleep, but she rested, content in the knowledge that she was doing what was needed, simply by staying still. The night felt less like something happening to her, and more like something she was participating in. Jacob let his breathing slow slightly, testing the boundary again. He stayed alert enough to respond if needed, but he allowed a thin layer of rest to settle over him. His thoughts drifted to mornings, the quiet competence that would come when the children woke with stiff fingers and sleepy eyes, the unspoken pride in having made it through without complaint. He understood then that resilience was not built through speeches or explanations. It was built through nights like this, where the rules were simple and honest. where discomfort was real but not catastrophic, where children learned, without being told, that they could endure more than they thought. The tent held 7 people and 1 aging dog breathed through the cold together. No crying, no calling out, just small adjustments, quiet learning, and the steady passage of time. The night did not need their voices, and they did not give them. The cold did not retreat. It never did. It did not negotiate, soften, or test boundaries the way people imagine storms might. It simply existed, steady and impartial, filling the space outside the tent and pressing inward through fabric, ground, and breath. By now, the family had stopped thinking of it as an enemy. It was a condition, one that demanded accuracy, not defiance. Jacob lay still. His body settled into a narrow band between warmth and loss. He did not add layers. He did not pull his sleeping bag tighter around his face. He did not shift closer to anyone else. All of those things would have felt comforting, but comfort was not the goal. He knew from experience that overheating, even slightly, led to sweat, and sweat led to cold that no amount of insulation could undo. Warmth that should not be maintained became a liability, so he kept it enough insulation to preserve heat, enough exposure to keep moisture from building, enough awareness to correct without reacting. This balance was something Jacob had learned the hard way. Years earlier, on a solo winter route farther north, he had tried to outmatch the cold, adding layers, sealing every opening, curling into himself too tightly. By morning, his base layer had frozen stiff against his skin. He had survived that night, but barely, and the memory of peeling frozen fabric away with numb fingers had stayed with him. Since then, he trusted restraint more than force. Now, in the dark, he monitored his body the way a mechanic listened to an engine, attentive to subtle changes, uninterested in pushing limits. His breathing remained deliberate. His skin stayed dry. The cold touched him, but did not take hold. Around him, the tent felt less like a barrier and more like a membrane. Thin, flexible, responsive. The wind moved along it instead of through it. Snow piled and slid away. The system held because it did not fight what it could not win. Emily sensed the same thing in her own body. She resisted the urge to tuck her chin deeper or draw her arms closer. She knew how quickly heat became moisture, how quickly moisture became danger. Her training as a nurse had taught her to respect thresholds, to understand when intervention helped and when it harmed. Tonight, doing less was the skill. She felt the children near her, their warmth gentle and uneven, their movements minimal. They were not perfectly comfortable. They were not suffering either. They were within the margin that allowed the body to adapt rather than panic. Emily trusted that margin. Samuel, awake again now, shifted his attention inward. He had lived his entire life without trying to conquer the land. As a boy, he had been taught that the land did not respond to dominance. It responded to understanding. You did not push against winter. You arranged yourself within it. Lying there, breath slow and shallow, Samuel brought one gloved hand to his chest. His fingers were thick joints swollen from years of cold labor, but the movement was precise. He closed his eyes and leaned into memory, into language older than instruction manuals and survival courses. He whispered a prayer. The words were not English. They were fragments of a language his grandmother had spoken when he was young, a language that had been fading even then. The sounds were soft, nearly indistinguishable from breath, shaped more by intention than volume. It was not a request for mercy. It was not a plea for warmth. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition of the mountain as present, of the night as whole, of himself as small, but aloud. Samuel had learned that prayer, not in a church or ceremony, but beside a fire as a child, listening to elders speak to the land as one spoke to a relative. Not with fear, not with entitlement, but with respect. Those elders had survived winters without naming them victories. They had simply remained. The words settled into him now, slowing his thoughts, anchoring his breathing. He did not expect an answer. That was not the purpose. The purpose was alignment. Ranger stirred as Samuel whispered, lifting his head slightly. The dog did not understand the words, but he sensed the shift in tone, the quiet intention. His ears angled forward, then relaxed. He resettled, satisfied. The children slept on, unaware of the exchange. Ethan's breathing was deep and steady now, his small body having found a rhythm that worked. Noah lay sprawled slightly, one knee bent, toes pressed against warmth, face relaxed. Grace remained still, her expression neutral, even in sleep, as if she conserved emotion as carefully as energy. Lily rested with her hands folded near her chest, posture calm, controlled. Jacob felt something ease in his chest, not from oxygen or heat, but from recognition. This was the state he aimed for on nights like this. Not comfort, not struggle, balance. He did not imagine the cold as something to be beaten back. He let it exist. He let it shape his decisions without dictating them. The mountain outside did not care whether he survived. It would be there either way. Accepting that truth freed him from the urge to perform, to prove. Instead, he stayed. The wind shifted slightly, its tone changing as it slid across a different angle of terrain. The tent responded with a soft adjustment, fabric tightening, then easing. Snow whispered downward. The night continued, unremarkable, and absolute. Samuel finished his prayer and let his hand fall back to his side. He did not repeat the words. Once was enough. He returned to stillness, content. Emily drifted close to sleep, not fully, but enough to rest her mind. Her body remained aware, but no longer tense. She trusted the systems they had put in place, the layers, the water, the discipline. She trusted Jacob's judgment. She trusted the quiet competence she felt around her. Jacob let his breathing slow one fraction more, testing again, careful not to cross the line. He remained dry. He remained present. This was not a battle. It was an agreement. The family did not ask the night to spare them. They did not challenge it to do worse. They arranged themselves within it, accepted its terms, and conserved what mattered. Outside, the mountain stood unchanged. Inside, 7 people and 1 aging dog remained exactly where they needed to be. And that was enough. The cold reached its deepest point, sometime after the night had passed its middle, when time lost its meaning and the body measured hours, not by clocks, but by sensation. Around 2 in the morning, the temperature dropped another quiet degree, then another, settling into a depth that felt final. Outside the tent, the snow no longer shifted or whispered. It lay still, locked in place. The wind thinned to a lower, heavier sound, pressing without urgency, as if even it had grown tired. Inside, the tent stiffened. Fabric that had flexed earlier now felt rigid, each movement producing a faint crackle as frost thickened along the seams. The air inside grew sharper, denser, and every breath felt slightly more expensive. The ground pad beneath them seemed to surrender its remaining warmth, becoming a cold plate that drew heat steadily downward. This was the hour Jacob had been waiting for. He did not know the time precisely, but his body recognized it instantly. This was the point when systems were tested, when small margins disappeared, and only what truly worked remained. He lay motionless, aware of every contact point between his body and the ground, adjusting nothing unless it was absolutely necessary. His breathing slowed almost too much, then corrected. His fingers tingled faintly, then warmed again as circulation held. The tent felt close now, not comforting, but containing, like the inside of a held breath. Emily felt it too. She surfaced fully from her half-sleep, awareness snapping into sharp focus without panic. The air inside the tent had changed. It was drier, colder, less forgiving. She resisted the urge to pull her sleeping bag tighter or tuck her chin deeper. That instinct, she knew, was dangerous. It led to condensation, and condensation led to ice. She listened. The children were quieter now, their movements minimal. Ethan's breathing remained steady, though shallower than before. Noah's breath paused for a fraction too long, then resumed. Lily's breathing was controlled, almost conscious even in sleep. Grace lay very still, her chest rising and falling evenly, her small body conserving energy with instinctive precision. Emily held herself between action and restraint, choosing observation over interference. This was the hour when mistakes happened. Not because people did the wrong thing, but because they did too much. As she lay there, the cold pressing in from all sides, a memory surfaced uninvited. She remembered a man from the clinic, mid-40s, a construction worker from a nearby town, brought in during a harsh winter after being found unconscious in his truck. Hypothermia. Not dramatic at first. He had been cold, confused, then strangely calm. Too calm. Emily had watched his breathing slow as his body slipped into a deep, unearned sleep. She had spoken to him, shaken him gently, tried to keep him engaged. He had smiled once, faintly, and said he was tired. That was the last clear thing he'd said. He never woke up. The doctors explained it later in clinical terms. Core temperature, metabolic slowdown, loss of protective reflexes. But Emily remembered the stillness most of all. How peaceful he had looked. How wrong that peace had been. The memory sharpened her focus now. She checked herself first. Her fingers, her toes, the awareness behind her eyes. She was alert, cold, but present. Then she extended her attention outward, listening again to the children. to Jacob's breathing, to the faint sound of Samuel shifting slightly in his bag. Samuel was awake. He had woken slowly, the way old bodies did, stiffness pulling him back into awareness, inch by inch. His joints ached more now, the cold finding every place where bone met bone. He did not move much. Movement cost heat, and heat was precious. Instead, he focused inward, testing sensation. Fingers, stiff but responsive. Toes, numb but present. Breathing, shallow, controlled. He knew this hour well. Samuel had lived long enough to know that the middle of the night was the most honest part of winter. Not the excitement of dusk, not the promise of dawn, but this. When fatigue whispered that enough had been done, when the body wanted to surrender. He did not allow it. He shifted one shoulder carefully, redistributing pressure, then stilled himself again. The tent creaked softly in response. Jacob felt it immediately. The subtle change in the air, the way his breath cooled faster in his lungs. He responded without urgency, adjusting the rhythm just enough to stay within the narrow, safe band. He did not sit up. He did not reach for more layers. He trusted the preparation, the discipline, the long chain of small, correct decisions that had brought them here. The cold touched him more clearly now, but it did not penetrate. Outside, the mountain remained indifferent. Inside, the tent was nearly frozen solid. Frost coated the inner walls so thickly that it muted sound, turning even breath into something dull and distant. The zipper teeth glinted faintly with ice. The stove lay inert, metal cold and unyielding. Water bottles remained liquid, just barely, radiating a subtle warmth that mattered more now than it had hours ago. Emily shifted her attention back to Grace, listening closely. Grace's breathing remained steady, though slower now, deeper. Emily did not touch her. She remembered the man from the clinic, the danger of letting the body slip too far. But Grace was not there. Grace was cold, but engaged. There was a difference. Emily kept herself awake deliberately, not by fear, but by purpose. She focused on small details. The sound of wind against the tent, the faint crackle of frost settling, the rhythm of Jacob's breath. She let the memory of the patient remain with her, not as guilt or sorrow, but as instruction. Do not let the night take more than it is owed. Jacob sensed Emily's wakefulness without seeing her. There was a tension to the air that came only when both of them were alert. He felt steadied by it. This was partnership, quiet and unspoken. The children slept on, deep enough to rest, shallow enough to remain. None cried out. None shivered uncontrollably. Their small bodies had adapted to the cold's rhythm, learning in real time what words could not teach. Ranger lifted his head briefly, sensing the shift in temperature. His breath puffed white against the darkness. He repositioned himself closer to the center of the tent, pressing his side against Noah's bag, sharing warmth without thought. Then he lay still again, conserving. Minutes stretched long. The cold held. Jacob felt the edge again. The pull toward deeper sleep, the temptation to let go. He did not. He remembered mornings when people did not wake, when effort had ended too early. He remembered his own near misses, the lessons carved into him by cold and consequence. He stayed. Emily stayed. Samuel stayed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cold stopped deepening. It did not ease, but it held, as if the night had reached its lowest point and decided not to press further. The hardest hour passed without ceremony. No alarms, no emergencies, just presence. And that, in a night like this, was survival. The wind did not ease after the hardest hour passed. It did not surge either. It simply continued, unchanged, a long, unbroken force that pressed against the tent with the same weight and rhythm it had carried for hours. There was no drama in it now, no sharp gusts or sudden shifts. The wind had settled into itself, and in doing so, it asked a different kind of endurance, patience. Inside the tent, time became elastic. Without a clock, without light, the night no longer progressed in steps. It stretched, held, and stretched again. The cold remained severe but stable, a constant presence rather than a threat that escalated. The family existed within this narrow equilibrium, sustained by routine, restraint, and attention. Jacob remained awake. He did not fight the wakefulness anymore. Instead, he used it. His breathing stayed deliberate, but his focus shifted outward, toward the sound that had become the night's dominant feature. The wind's voice pressed through the tent wall, a deep, continuous roar layered with subtle variations. It rose slightly, fell slightly, then returned to its baseline, repeating the pattern with almost mechanical precision. Jacob began to count it, not seconds, not minutes, intervals. He counted the longer pushes, the moments when the fabric bowed inward and held for a breath or two before releasing. Then he counted the softer passages, when the pressure eased just enough for the tent to recover its shape fully. 1, 2, 3. Each cycle blended into the next, but the act of counting anchored him. This was how he kept his mind from drifting too far inward, where fatigue and cold could distort perception. Counting gave shape to the formless. It turned waiting into activity. 10 cycles passed, then another 10. His body remained still, conserving heat. His thoughts stayed narrow, practical. He did not imagine morning yet. He did not calculate distance or plan the next day. That would come later. For now, there was only the wind and the task of remaining present within it. Emily slept lightly, surfacing now and then when the tone of the wind shifted just enough to register. She did not open her eyes. She did not move. She trusted Jacob's wakefulness, the way he trusted her vigilance earlier. They had learned, over years together, how to alternate awareness without announcing it. Samuel rested in long, shallow intervals, waking briefly whenever the tent creaked in a way that differed from the established pattern. Each time, he confirmed the structure was holding, then let himself drift again. His experience told him that the most dangerous nights were not the loudest ones, but the ones that tempted people into thinking the storm had passed. This one offered no such temptation. The children remained quiet. Their bodies had found a rhythm that worked with the wind rather than against it. Ethan's breathing rose and fell in short, regular bursts. Noah lay still, exhaustion outweighing discomfort now. Grace remained tucked into herself, conserving energy with a precision that would have surprised anyone who did not know her story. Lily hovered near wakefulness, mind alert but calm, the wind's rhythm seeping into her thoughts until it became almost hypnotic. Ranger lifted his head occasionally, responding to instinct rather than sound. His thick fur rippled slightly as the tent wall pressed inward and released. He did not growl. He did not whine. He simply watched and waited, his aging body understanding that nothing new was being asked of him. Outside, the wind scoured the snowfields relentlessly. It erased shallow tracks, smoothed uneven drifts, reshaped the surface of the plateau inch by inch. If anything passed near the tent, an animal, a shifting ridge of snow, it left no lasting mark. The land was in motion, even if it looked still. Jacob counted again. 20 cycles. His thoughts threatened to blur at the edges, not into sleep, but into a dullness that could be just as dangerous. He tightened his focus slightly, listening more carefully. The wind was not entirely uniform. There were small variations, micro pauses, slight changes in pitch that revealed the contours of the terrain around them. A rise to the west, a shallow depression to the south. The tent sat in a pocket that deflected the worst of it, just enough. He found comfort in those details. The wind was no longer just noise. It was information. Minutes stretched. The cold held steady. Frost continued to thicken along the inner walls, dulling reflections and softening sound. The tent felt like a sealed capsule now, isolated from the wider world except through pressure and vibration. Emily surfaced again briefly, her awareness sharp but calm. She listened to the wind, then to the breathing around her. Everything remained within acceptable bounds. She let herself rest again, not fully asleep but not actively watching either. Samuel adjusted one shoulder, then stilled. His body reminded him of its age with a quiet ache. He acknowledged it and moved on. Pain, like cold, was only a problem if it demanded reaction. Jacob reached another milestone in his counting without realizing it. 50 cycles. He stopped counting then, not because the task was complete, but because it no longer served him. The wind had become background again, absorbed into the larger sense of being held in place by the night. He shifted his attention inward, checking his body once more. Hands, responsive. Feet, cold, but functional. Breathing, steady. He allowed himself a longer rest interval, knowing he could pull back if needed. The wind did not change. That was its test. Not violence, not surprise. Endurance. The night offered no relief in variety, no distraction. It asked the same question again and again. Can you remain without needing something to happen? The family answered without words. They remained. Eventually, even the wind's constancy became something like a companion. Its roar blurred into a steady presence, neither threatening nor comforting. Just there. Jacob let his breathing deepen slightly, trusting his awareness to wake him if the balance shifted. He did not dream. He did not fully sleep. He rested within the rhythm he had chosen. The wind continued to press against the tent, hour after hour, unchanged. And the tent held. The first change was not light. It was absence. Somewhere beyond the tent walls, the night loosened its grip, just enough to be noticed. The wind did not stop, but its weight shifted. The cold remained, but it no longer deepened. The darkness, which had felt solid for hours, thinned at the edges like breath on glass beginning to fade. Jacob sensed it before he saw anything. His eyes were still closed, his body resting in the narrow balance he had held all night, when something eased inside him. Not relief, not warmth, just a subtle release, as if the night had stopped asking questions. He did not move. He waited for confirmation. Then it came. A faint, diluted glow pressed against the tent fabric. So weak it could have been imagined. Not dawn, not even pre-dawn, just the suggestion that the world beyond the canvas had begun to shift its color from absolute black to something less complete. The frost lining the inner walls reflected it dimly, turning from dull grey to a barely perceptible blue. The night was not over, but it was weakening. Emily opened her eyes. She did not sit up or stretch. She simply allowed her awareness to expand outward, reassessing the space with fresh attention. The children were still. The tent held. The air remained cold and thin, but it felt different now. Less brittle, more breathable. The faintest increase in oxygen, imperceptible by measurement, registered in the body as possibility. She exhaled slowly. Samuel woke next. Not suddenly, but in layers. First awareness, then sensation, then memory. He recognized the change immediately. He had learned long ago to trust these transitions, to mark them without celebrating. Dawn was not safety, but it was direction. He shifted his gaze toward the tent wall, where the faint light pressed through. It reminded him of early mornings decades ago, waiting for just enough visibility to move without stumbling, to hunt without wasting energy. That color, thin, cold blue, meant patience had been rewarded, not finished. Ranger lifted his head and huffed quietly, breath fogging the dim interior. His ears pricked, not in alarm, but curiosity. Morning always brought new information. Scent, sound, movement. He did not stand. He waited. The children slept on. Ethan stirred first, rolling slightly, face pressing into the edge of his hood. His breathing deepened, then steadied. He did not wake fully. His body recognized the shift without needing to name it. Noah murmured once, a half-formed sound that dissolves before becoming language. He drew his knees up closer, seeking warmth instinctively, then stilled. Lily's eyes fluttered open briefly. She registered the faint light, the way it softened the darkness, rather than breaking it. She felt something loosen in her chest. Not excitement, not anticipation, but acknowledgement. She closed her eyes again, choosing rest over readiness. Grace woke quietly. Her eyes opened without effort, brown and alert, reflecting the faint glow as if it belonged to her. She did not move at first. She simply looked, absorbing the change with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to rush transitions. Grace was 8 years old, small for her age, with straight dark hair that framed her face even in sleep. Loss had taught her caution early. She did not assume good things would last, but she noticed them when they appeared. She saw the light. It was barely there. Just a thinning of darkness, a promise rather than an arrival. But it was enough. Grace smiled. It was not wide or exuberant. It did not wake anyone. It was a small, private smile, the kind that belonged to moments no one else needed to witness. For her, it meant something simple and profound. The night had not taken them. Emily noticed the change in Grace immediately. Not through sound or movement, but through presence. She turned her head slightly and saw the faint curve of the child's mouth, the open, awake eyes. Emily did not speak. She returned the smile with one of her own, barely visible in the dim light. No words were needed. This was not a moment to break the quiet. It was a moment to let it settle. Jacob opened his eyes then. The light met him softly, filtered through layers of fabric and frost. He blinked once, then let his gaze rest. His body responded with a subtle shift. Muscles loosening just a fraction. Breath deepening without effort. He did not sit up. He did not stretch. He acknowledged the change and remained still. The hardest work of the night was done. Not finished, but done. Outside, the wind continued, but its voice had lost its dominance. It no longer defined the space. The mountain remained, immense and indifferent, but now it was outlined faintly in the mind by the promise of shape and distance. The tent felt less like a capsule and more like shelter. Samuel closed his eyes again, not to sleep deeply, but to rest honestly. His prayer from earlier no longer echoed in his thoughts. It had done its work. The land had listened in its own way. Emily allowed herself a longer breath, careful not to move too much, careful not to rush the transition from night to morning. She knew better than to assume safety simply because light had returned. But she also knew what this moment meant. They had stayed. Grace held the smile for another second, then let it fade naturally. She did not announce her wakefulness. She simply lay there, watching the light grow slightly stronger, content to exist within it. The night had not ended, but it had released them. And that was enough for now. The light continued to grow, but no one greeted it. It did not arrive with colour or warmth, only with clarity. Shapes emerged slowly through the tent fabric. Edges where there had been none, distinctions where everything had blended together for hours. The frost lining the walls dulled from opaque white to a pale sheen. Breath no longer vanished instantly, lingering just long enough to be seen. Still, no one spoke. There was no rush to sit up, no sudden stretch of stiff limbs, no laughter of relief. The night had released them, but it had not transformed into something else yet. Morning, here, was not an event. It was a condition that developed quietly, without ceremony. Jacob lay where he was, eyes open now, breathing deeper without effort. His body registered the change immediately. Muscles loosening, circulation improving, the sharp edge of vigilance softening. He did not mistake this for victory. He had learned not to. Surviving a winter night did not mean it had been conquered. It only meant the rules had been followed closely enough. Emily shifted slightly, testing sensation in her fingers and toes. They were stiff, aching, but responsive. She welcomed the ache. Pain meant presence. She did not smile. She did not allow relief to rush through her. Relief could make people careless. The children woke gradually. Ethan stirred first, blinking against the dim light with unfocused curiosity. His hair stuck out from beneath his hat in damp tufts, eyelashes rimmed with frost where breath had escaped his hood. He yawned silently, then curled his fingers inside his mittens, feeling warmth return. He did not ask questions. He sensed, intuitively, that this was not the moment for noise. Noah woke next, eyes opening wider, awareness sharper. He flexed his feet carefully, testing the liners beneath the sleeping bag. When he felt that they were still warm, his shoulders relaxed. He did not announce the success. He simply held on to it. Lily sat up slowly, posture controlled, movements economical. She felt taller this morning, though nothing about her body had changed. Endurance had a way of doing that, stretching something internal until it felt visible. She glanced at her siblings, then at her parents, reading the room without needing instruction. Grace woke quietly, already alert. The small smile from earlier had faded into calm attentiveness. She looked around, cataloguing faces, reassured by their presence. She did not cling or seek reassurance. She had learned that survival often came without applause. Ranger stood, joints stiff, stretching carefully before shaking frost from his coat. His fur had gone rigid in places, but his eyes were bright, tail wagging once, then stilling. Even he seemed to understand that this was not a moment for excitement. He moved to the tent entrance and sat, watching the light intensify. Samuel was the last to speak. He had sat up slowly, breath controlled, hands resting on his knees. In the growing light, his face looked older than it had the day before. Lines deeper, skin drawn tight by cold and fatigue. But his eyes were clear, calm. He looked around the tent once, taking in the quiet wakefulness of his family, the absence of distress, the fact that everyone was present and accounted for. Then he spoke, voice low and unhurried. "We're allowed to continue." The words landed gently, without emphasis. Not "we made it," not "we won," not even "we survived." Allowed. Emily felt something settle in her chest at that. The phrasing mattered. It framed the night correctly. Not as an adversary defeated, but as a condition endured with permission rather than entitlement. Jacob nodded once, acknowledging the truth of it. He had seen enough of the mountains to know how quickly permission could be withdrawn. Outside, the wind still moved across the plateau, though it had lost its edge. Snow drifted lightly, reshaping the surface inch by inch. The mountain remained unchanged, vast and uninterested in their small human accounting. The tent no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a pause between states. Jacob reached slowly for the zipper, fingers stiff but steady. He did not open it yet. Cold rushed in when he moved too quickly. Instead, he waited, letting the warmth inside stabilize, letting bodies adjust to wakefulness. Emily checked the children with a practiced glance. Color in cheeks, clarity in eyes, movements controlled. No one showed signs of dangerous cold. No one shivered uncontrollably. It was enough. Lily helped Ethan sit up, her hand firm and quiet. Noah began packing small items into his bag without being asked. Grace folded her blanket carefully, attention focused. as if the act itself carried meaning. No one joked. No one celebrated. There would be hot food later. Movement, maybe even laughter once circulation returned fully. But not now. Now was for restraint, for acknowledging what had been given, and not assuming it would last forever. Samuel reached out and rested his hand briefly on the tent wall, feeling the stiffness of frost beneath his palm. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. "Same rules," he said softly, "just different light." Jacob understood. So did Emily. The children absorbed it without fully knowing how. Daylight did not cancel discipline. It only revealed consequences more clearly. The zipper opened a fraction, then another. Pale morning light spilled in, cold and clean. Air rushed through, sharp but welcome. Ranger leaned forward, sniffing deeply, mapping the world anew. No one stepped outside yet. They were still inside the night shadow, still between states. That was where care mattered most. Jacob sat still, letting the light touch his face, letting warmth return slowly. He did not feel triumphant. He felt precise, balanced, ready to continue, without assuming the path ahead would be easier. No one had won. The night had not been defeated. The mountain had not been challenged. They had simply remained. And that, for now, was permission enough. The zipper opened slowly, one careful pull at a time, until the cold air slid into the tent like water finding a gap. It was sharp, clean, unmistakably morning. Jacob paused with the opening, no wider than his forearm, letting the temperature equalize, before inviting the rest of the world inside. Outside, the light had strengthened just enough to give the snow texture. Ripples, shadows, the faint blue-grey depth that only appeared after a long night. No one rushed out. Morning, here, was approached the way night had been endured. Deliberately. Jacob swung his legs free of the sleeping bag and sat, boots still out of reach, feet pressing briefly against the insulated ground pad. His movements were stiff, but controlled, his breath steady. The cold bit immediately at exposed skin, but it lacked the urgency it had carried hours earlier. It was still present, still absolute, but it no longer demanded constant correction. Emily followed him out of the tent a few minutes later, shoulders hunched instinctively against the air. She was smaller than Jacob, compact and efficient in her movements. Her dark hair still braided tight. Her face held the quiet focus she wore at the clinic when situations were stable but required attention. She scanned the immediate area. Snow conditions, wind direction, the shape of drifts near the tent. Then nodded once to herself. The night had released them into a workable morning. Samuel emerged next, slower, bracing himself briefly against a trekking pole as he stepped down onto the packed snow. His breath clouded thickly in front of him. He stood still for a moment, letting the cold settle into his joints rather than fighting it. His posture straightened gradually, the stiffness easing just enough to move. Ranger burst from the tent last, energy returning with daylight. He shook himself vigorously, frost scattering from his coat in a fine spray. His tail wagged once, then twice, before settling into a slow, contented sweep. He trotted a short distance from the tent, sniffing the air deeply. mapping the morning with his nose. The children followed, one by one. Lily stepped out first, careful and composed, pulling her hat lower over her ears. She took in the landscape with quiet curiosity, noting how familiar it looked. Now that it was visible, Noah and Ethan came next, bundled and blinking, their faces flushed pink from cold and excitement. Grace lingered near Emily, absorbing the scene without comment. The fire came next. Jacob and Samuel worked together, movements economical, as if continuing a conversation that had begun years earlier. They cleared a small area down to compacted snow, arranging a simple windbreak with chunks of ice and packed drift. Samuel knelt carefully, hands steady despite the cold, and struck the fire starter. The first spark caught slowly, then steadied. A small flame appeared, weak at first, then growing as dry tinder took hold. The sound was subtle, but unmistakable. A soft crackle that cut through the open silence of the plateau. Fire. The warmth spread outward in a narrow circle. Not enough to change the air, but enough to change perception. Hands hovered near it. Shoulders relaxed a fraction. The cold was still there, still pressing at the edges, but it had lost its authority. Emily poured water into the pot, the liquid moving freely, proof that the night's work had mattered. She set it over the flame and waited, steam beginning to rise almost immediately. The smell of heat, metal warming, water shifting state, felt grounding. Noah noticed his breath first. He lifted his mittened hands toward the sun, which now hovered just above the distant ridgeline. Pale and cold, he exhaled deliberately and watched as the vapor formed, then disappeared into the light. He did it again, slower this time, amused by how quickly it vanished. Ethan saw him and laughed, a small, surprised sound that seemed almost too loud in the open air. He tried it too, puffing his breath out in exaggerated clouds, eyes wide with wonder. The vapor caught the sunlight and dissolved, leaving nothing behind. They laughed quietly together, sharing the discovery without needing to explain it. Grace watched them, a small smile forming as she stood close to Emily's side. She lifted her own breath into the air once, then again, testing the way it faded. She did not laugh aloud, but the satisfaction showed in her eyes. Lily observed the moment with a different awareness. She recognized the shift, not just in temperature, but in mood. This was the first sign that the night's discipline could loosen. Just a little. She tucked that understanding away, knowing it would matter later. In other nights, other places. Samuel sat near the fire now, palms open toward the heat, face turned slightly upward. In the daylight, his features looked softer, the hard lines of night easing into something more familiar. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply accepted the warmth as it came, neither clinging to it nor taking it for granted. Jacob watched the fire carefully, adjusting fuel and airflow with practiced ease. He felt the warmth on his face, the stiffness in his legs slowly releasing. The cold still surrounded them, still held the ground in its grip, but it no longer felt like a test. It felt like context. Emily handed out warm water in small sips, monitoring without making it obvious. She watched the children drink, color returning to their faces, energy shifting from inward conservation to outward readiness. She did not rush them. Recovery took time. Ranger lay down near the fire, one side facing the heat, eyes half closed. His body relaxed into the snow, content to let warmth reach him without effort. He sighed deeply, a sound that seemed to signal completion. The wind still moved across the plateau, but it flowed around the fire now, deflected by the heat's presence. The sound softened, no longer a constant roar, but a background movement. It was still cold, still winter, but the threat had receded. Jacob straightened and looked out across the snow, eyes scanning the route they would take later, the distant line of trees barely visible in the morning haze. He did not plan yet. He did not measure distance or time. For now, this moment was enough. No one spoke of the night. No one recounted difficulties or listed what had gone right. Those stories could wait, or never be told. What mattered was here. Warmth earned. Light returned. The body's slow shift from survival to function. Noah nudged Ethan with his elbow, pointing to the way the steam from the pot curled upward and vanished. Ethan grinned back. The sound of their quiet laughter mixing with the crackle of the fire. Emily watched them and felt something ease inside her. Not relief exactly, but confirmation. The night had taken nothing from them that could not be restored. Samuel leaned back slightly, resting on his hands. "Good fire," he said at last, voice low and steady. Jacob nodded. Enough. And that was the word that fit the morning best. The fire burned. The cold remained. But it no longer ruled. The fire burned lower now, settled into a steady bed of coals that radiated warmth without urgency. Morning had established itself fully, not warm, not forgiving, but workable. The light sharpened the edges of the plateau, revealing the fine texture of snow crust and the faint lines where wind had sculpted the ground through the night. Breath still showed in the air, but it no longer startled anyone when it did. Breakfast was not announced. It arrived the way everything else had. Quietly, as the next necessary step, Jacob knelt near the fire and opened the food bag with careful hands. His fingers were stiff, nails rimmed with pale frost that cracked away as circulation returned. He moved without haste, selecting items by habit rather than preference. Energy mattered more than taste this morning. Calories mattered more than comfort. He laid out the portions on a folded tarp. Dense oat bars compressed into bricks, packets of nut paste, dried fruit stiff with cold, and a small pouch of powdered drink mix meant to dissolve into warm water. Nothing was appetizing in the conventional sense. Everything was purposeful. Samuel watched from a short distance, seated on a low pack, his posture relaxed but attentive. In daylight, his age was more visible. Skin weathered, shoulders narrow beneath layers. But there was no fragility in the way he observed. He had eaten breakfasts like this for most of his life. He knew their value. Emily took the pot from the fire once the water reached the right temperature. Not boiling, not steaming aggressively, just warm enough to accept powder without destroying it. She poured carefully, stirring until the liquid turned a dull, cloudy tan. The smell was faint and utilitarian. No one commented. She handed out cups first, then the food. The children accepted their portions without protest. Ethan took his bar in both hands and examined it briefly, as if confirming it was real. He took a bite and chewed slowly, jaw working with effort. The bar was hard, resistant, and nearly flavorless in the cold. He did not complain. He took another bite. Noah followed, squeezing the nut paste carefully from its packet, licking a small amount from his glove before correcting himself and wiping it away. He chewed, paused, then swallowed with determination. His expression was serious, focused on the task rather than the pleasure. Grace ate last, small bites taken deliberately, eyes lowered. She did not rush. She did not grimace. She treated the food with quiet respect, as if aware that it was not meant to be enjoyed, only used. The powder drink warmed her hands as much as her throat, and she held the cup longer than necessary before taking another sip. Lily sat slightly apart, legs crossed, her portion already half finished. She ate with the efficiency of someone who understood time and energy as linked variables. She glanced occasionally at her siblings, not to supervise, but to notice. She saw the way Ethan persisted through texture, the way Noah corrected himself, the way Grace conserved movement. She recognized the changes without naming them. Emily watched all of this from the edge of the firelight. She did not instruct. She did not encourage. She simply observed, her gaze moving from one child to the next, cataloguing details the way she did with patience. Color in cheeks, steadiness of hands, focus in eyes. What she saw unsettled her in a quiet, unexpected way. They had changed, not dramatically, not visibly, to anyone else, but she could feel it in the way they ate, the way they held their bodies, the absence of complaint. The night had reached into them and rearranged something fundamental. Not fear, not toughness, but awareness. They understood effort now. They understood limits. They understood that comfort was conditional. Emily felt a tightening in her throat and looked away, focusing instead on the pot, the fire, the mechanics of the morning. This was not a moment for sentiment. Sentiment distracted from what still needed doing. Jacob ate quickly, standing, his portion gone in minutes. He drank last, finishing the cup and turning it upside down in the snow to dry. He felt the calories register almost immediately, not as fullness, but as stability. His hand steadied. His legs felt more responsive. The cold receded to the background where it belonged. Samuel ate more slowly, chewing with care, giving his body time to adjust. He took a sip of warm drink and closed his eyes briefly, not in pleasure, but in acknowledgement. Enough. Ranger received his share next. A compact ration pressed into a small bowl, softened slightly with warm water. He ate with enthusiasm, restrained by age, tail thumping once against the snow before he settled into a steady rhythm. He licked the bowl clean and looked up expectantly, then lay down when no more came. The fire crackled softly, consuming the last of the tinder. Jacob fed it once more, then let it burn down naturally. No one lingered near it unnecessarily. Warmth was appreciated, not hoarded. Emily handed out the final sips of drink and watched as the children finished. Ethan wiped his mouth with his sleeve and glanced up at her. Eyes bright, but calm. Noah nodded to himself, as if completing a task. Grace folded her empty wrapper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Emily met Jacob's eyes briefly. He had seen it too. The night had not frightened them. It had instructed them. Samuel cleared his throat softly. "That'll do," he said, voice neutral. Jacob nodded. "It will." They did not linger over the meal. There was no sense of scarcity pressing them to eat more. No anxiety pushing them to pack up immediately. The rhythm of the morning unfolded naturally, one step following the last without hurry. Emily gathered the wrappers, checking the children's gloves and hats with light touches, correcting small things without comment. She felt steadier now, her earlier vigilance easing into readiness. As the family finished breakfast, the plateau brightened another degree. Shadows shortened. The wind shifted direction, less direct, less demanding. The cold remained, but it no longer defined the space. Emily watched the children once more. How they stood, how they moved, how they waited. She saw the quiet confidence settling into them, the absence of expectation that someone else would fix discomfort for them. It unsettled her and comforted her in equal measure. She understood then that the night had given them something she could not have taught, no matter how carefully she tried. Jacob shouldered the pack and looked out across the snow, already measuring the path ahead without committing to it. There would be time for movement soon. For now, the morning held. No one spoke of hunger. No one spoke of fear. They had eaten. They were ready, and that was enough. The fire had settled into a steady, patient burn, no longer hungry, no longer demanding constant attention. It gave off warmth in quiet pulses, enough to be felt without drawing anyone too close. Around it, the snow reflected the early sun in soft sheets of white and pale blue, untouched except for the narrow ring where boots had compressed it into something solid and real. The night's frost still clung to shadows, but it was retreating now, loosening its grip one surface at a time. The family sat in a loose circle around the fire. No one rushed to stand. No one hurried to pack. This moment was not an intermission between hardships. It was a place they were allowed to occupy. Jacob sat slightly apart, legs stretched out, hands resting on his knees. In the daylight, the fatigue showed more clearly in him. All dark circles beneath his eyes. The stiffness in his shoulders when he shifted. He was a tall man, broad through the chest, built by years of carrying weight over uneven ground. His face, weathered by wind and sun, held a calm that was not passive but earned. Experience had taught him how to be present without needing to dominate the space. Emily sat close to the fire, palms open toward the warmth, eyes half-lidded. She looked smaller in the open light, compact and steady. Her posture relaxed now that vigilance could ease. Her dark hair had come loose from its braid, a few strands catching the sunlight. There was softness in her expression that had not been there during the night. A quiet return to herself after hours of careful restraint. Samuel sat on a low pack opposite Jacob. spine straight, despite the ache that lived in his bones. The morning light revealed the full map of his years. Creases carved deep by cold, hands thick and scarred from labor and weather. Yet there was nothing fragile about him. His presence was grounded, unhurried, as if time itself had learned to move at his pace. He warmed his hands slowly, accepting heat the way he accepted everything else, without greed. The children were scattered between the adults. Ethan sat closest to the fire, boots planted firmly in the snow, face tilted toward the sun. His cheeks were flushed, eyes bright with a tired satisfaction he did not yet have words for. He leaned forward occasionally, drawn by the warmth, then leaned back again, testing how close was close enough. Each movement was exploratory, curious rather than restless. Noah sat beside him, quieter now, knees pulled up, arms wrapped loosely around them. He watched the way the firelight flickered across the snow, the way shadows shifted and reformed. His face held a thoughtful seriousness that had deepened overnight. He was no longer scanning for discomfort. He was simply observing. Grace sat between Emily and Samuel, wrapped in her jacket, hands folded in her lap. She watched everyone in turn, eyes lingering on faces as if committing them to memory. The sunlight caught in her dark hair, softening the lines of her face. She looked older than she had the day before, not in years, but in presence. There was a steadiness in her now, a quiet assurance that came from having stayed through something difficult without being overwhelmed by it. Lily stood for a while, then sat near Jacob, leaning slightly against his shoulder without comment. She did not need to ask permission. Her posture was relaxed, confident, the movements of someone who had found her place naturally. She watched the others with an awareness that bordered on adulthood, recognizing the shared fatigue, the shared relief, without needing to label either. Ranger lay just beyond the circle of heat, one side warmed by the fire, the other cooled by snow. His coat glinted in the sun, frost melting slowly from the tips of his fur. He sighed deeply and rested his chin on his paws, eyes half closed. At 11, his movements were slower, his naps longer, but his presence remained constant. He had stayed too, for a long while. No one spoke. The world around them continued as it always had. The wind moved lightly across the plateau, no longer pressing, just passing through. Somewhere far off, snow slid from a ridge with a soft, distant sound. The mountain did not acknowledge them. It did not need to. Jacob looked around the circle, taking in each face. He did not feel pride in the way people talked about survival stories. There was no swelling sense of accomplishment, no urge to frame the night as something they had beaten. What he felt was quieter and heavier than that. They were still here. He saw it in Ethan's easy breathing, in Noah's stillness, in Grace's calm watchfulness. He saw it in Emily's softened posture, in Samuel's unhurried presence. He saw it in Lily's quiet confidence, in Ranger's relaxed sprawl. They were tired, but they were present. They had not slipped away. Jacob understood then, with a clarity that surprised him, that this was what he had been working toward all along. Not mastery over cold or terrain, not proving endurance to himself or anyone else. It was this simple state of remaining connected to the world after it had asked something difficult of them. Some people needed to win. They needed to stand at the end of an ordeal and claim victory, to frame survival as conquest. Jacob had learned that this need often led to mistakes, to pushing too far, to ignoring limits, to believing the world owed them something for their effort. He did not believe that. He believed in staying. Emily felt his gaze and looked up, meeting his eyes. There was no question in her expression, no need for reassurance. She understood what he was seeing because she felt it too. The night had not taken anything from them that could not be restored. In return, it had given something subtle but durable: presence. Samuel shifted slightly, easing his weight, then spoke without raising his voice. "Sun's good today," he said, as if noting the weather. Nothing more. Jacob nodded. "It is." The children listened, absorbing the tone as much as the words. There was no lesson delivered, no summary of the night's meaning. They did not need one. The experience itself had done the work. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes briefly, letting the sunlight warm his face. Noah traced a line in the snow with his glove, then brushed it away. Grace watched the fire until the movement of flame and shadow slowed her thoughts into something like peace. Lily rested her head against Jacob's shoulder for a moment, then straightened again, content. Ranger stretched, stood, and moved closer to the fire, turning once before lying down again. He looked around at the group, then closed his eyes. Jacob took one more slow look at each of them. He understood, finally, that happy endings did not always arrive with joy or celebration. Sometimes they arrived quietly, disguised as continuation. They were not heroes. They were not conquerors. They were people who had stayed with the world when it would have been easy or tempting to disappear into exhaustion or fear. The fire burned. The snow shone. The cold remained, but it no longer demanded everything. They were tired, but they were still here. And for this morning, that was more than enough. As this story comes to a quiet close, its lesson does not belong only to mountains, winter nights, or survival camps. It belongs to everyday life. Most of us are not facing sub-zero winds or frozen ground, but many of us face long nights of a different kind. Nights of exhaustion, of uncertainty, of responsibility that does not pause just because we are tired. In those moments, strength is not always loud. It is not about winning, proving, or pushing harder than everything around us. Sometimes strength is simply staying present, breathing carefully, doing what is necessary, not what feels dramatic. Choosing not to disappear when things become uncomfortable. This story reminds us that surviving difficulty is often about balance, about knowing when enough is enough, about conserving energy, protecting what matters, and trusting that small, steady actions can carry us through even the hardest hours. As you return to your own life, take this lesson with you. When things feel overwhelming, slow down. Focus on what is essential. Take care of yourself and those around you. Remember that you do not need to conquer every challenge. Some days, it is enough to remain. If this story brought you calm, reflection, or comfort, Consider sharing it with someone who might need a quiet moment too. Leave a comment and tell us where you are listening from tonight, or what part of the story stayed with you. If you believe that staying present through hardship is its own kind of strength, you may comment, Amen. And if you wish to continue these quiet journeys with us, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and join our growing community. May God bless you, protect you, and give you peace through every long night you face. May you always find the strength to stay with the world, one breath at a time. Amen.